Welcome back to this tutorial series on building the classic card game Solitaire with Phaser 3. Previously, in part 1 of our series, we went ahead and we did our initial project setup and we worked on loading in the assets we'll be using for our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. Alright, so now we finished loading in our game assets. That actually wraps up our section on our project setup. And now we're going to go ahead and focus on our game layout, and so we'll be building out the UI of our game. And so in this section, we'll be building out our 4 different card pile types that make up our game. And so we'll have our draw pile, our discard pile, our foundation piles, and then our tableau piles. And so to get started, we're going to go ahead and focus on our card draw pile first. And so for our card draw pile, this is going to be made up of 2 different game object types: a basic rectangle game object, and then multiple image game objects. And so we previously saw how we can go ahead and create image game objects to render out our images to our game. And so what a basic rectangle game object is, this is one of the built-in game objects to Phaser that allows you to create basic shapes. And this can be used for quickly creating these shapes in our game. And that's how we create these rectangles that we see here. So for our card draw pile, we'll be rendering out a simple rectangle to show where the card draw pile is placed in our game. And when there's no cards left in our card draw pile, this will be visible to the player. Then later on, the player will be able to click on that area and shuffle back in their discard cards so they'll continue playing. When there are cards in our draw pile, like now, we'll actually see our image game objects rendered on top of it, and now it looks like we have a stack of cards in that place. Alright, so to get started with our code changes, let's go ahead and jump over to our game scene. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some const variables to our class. And what these are going to be used for, these are just going to be for positioning our game objects where we want them to appear in our scene. And so what we'll do is we'll come to the top of our class, and let's go ahead and we'll make some new variables. So first we're going to do debug. And so what this is going to be used for is this is going to be used for drawing additional game objects to our scene. So then that way we can actually see what we're working with. And primarily this is going to apply to our zone game objects. So out of the box, your zone game objects are not visible to the player. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be adding additional rectangles to go ahead and draw out those shapes so we actually see where they're at in our game. For the time being, we'll set this to false, and we'll come back to address this later once we need to implement it. Next, we're going to go ahead and do scale. And so this is going to be used for scaling our image game objects. So currently, when we look at our card, currently it's quite small in our game. So let's go ahead and scale it up by this factor here, 1.5. Next, we're going to go ahead and store our X and Y positions, as well as the frames that are going to reference our card's sprite sheet. So we know which frames are tied to which part of the cards. So the first one will be const, and we'll do card back frame. This is going to be equal to 52. And then what we'll do is we'll do const. We're going to do suit frames. This will be an object. So on our object, we'll do each of our suits. And so we'll have heart, and this will be frame 26, diamond, and this will be frame 13. Then we'll have spades, and we'll do 39, and then finally club, and this will be 0. So real quick, if we take a look at our sprite sheet for our cards, we'll see that all of our cards are grouped by their suit. And so we have our clubs, then we'll have our diamonds, followed by hearts, and then spades. And so this frame here is going to reference the first frame where that suit starts in our sprite sheet. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and do our X and Y positions. So we'll do const. We're going to do our foundation pile, our X positions. And so for our foundation piles, we're going to have our 4 different piles. And so we'll have an X for each of those. So we'll just go ahead and store these in an array. So we'll have 360, 425, 490, then 555. Now, all of these will be in one Y position. So we're just we'll copy this, and this will just be a number. And so we'll change this to foundation pile Y, and we'll just say position. We'll set that equal to 5. Now let's go ahead and do our discard and our draw piles. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this here. I'm going to paste it a few times. And so instead of foundation, we're going to go ahead and do discard pile. And paste that, and we'll change this to X. So for our discard pile, we'll go ahead and do 85 for our X, 5 for a Y. I'm going to copy both of these. We'll go ahead and paste it. Let's go ahead and do our draw pile. And so we'll have draw pile X, draw pile Y. So for our X, this is going to go ahead and be 5. Y will be 5 as well, so it's lined up. And now we just need to do our tableau piles. And so for these, we're just going to go ahead and just do our first pile here. And we'll have the other one be based off of this position here. And we'll just have some spacing that's consistent between each of our piles. So we'll copy this. Let's go ahead and paste it one more time. And so we'll have our tableau. We'll have our pile X. And we'll have our tableau pile Y. And so for this one, it's going to go ahead and be 40 for our X. And it'll be 92 for our Y. All right, so next we'll go ahead and create our actual draw pile. And so to go ahead and do that, we're going to put all of that logic inside a new method. So in our class, let's go ahead and add a private method. And so we're going to go ahead and do private, and we'll do create draw pile. And this will return nothing, so it'll be void. And what we'll do in our create method, let's go ahead and call our new method. And we'll go ahead and just do this right above this. We'll do create draw pile. So now in our new method, what we'll do is first we'll go ahead and draw our outline for our pile. So we'll go ahead and draw out our rectangle. And so to do this, we'll put this in another method as well, because we'll be creating a number of these rectangles. And so we just want to be able to reuse that same logic. So what we'll do is we'll do this. Let's go ahead and do draw card location box. And so what we'll want to pass into this method is we're going to want the X and Y of where we're going to draw that rectangle to. And so since this is our draw pile, we'll go ahead and pass in our draw pile X and Y variables that we defined. Now let's go ahead and define that private method. And so we'll do draw card location box. And so we're going to expect X, which will be a number. We'll expect Y to be a number as well. And for this, we won't return anything. Let's go ahead and create our game object. So let's go ahead and in our method, we'll go ahead and create our rectangle shape. So to do this, we're going to reference our object factory. So we'll do this.add. Let's do rectangle. Now we want to go ahead and do our X and Y position. So we'll pass in the ones that we provided. Now we provide our width and our height. It's not for our rectangle. We want this to be a little bit bigger than our cards. And so we'll have 56 for our width, and then we'll have 78 for our height. And then next we have two optional arguments. It's going to be our fill color and our fill alpha. And so we don't want this to actually be filled in with any colors. So we're going to omit those arguments for the time being. And just so we can line them up where we expect, let's go and put our origin in the top left-hand corner. And now we're going to call set stroke style. And so what this method does is it allows us to basically define that stroke, so that line that defines our rectangle, kind of like a border. And so this will be that outer line that we define. And so when we do this, we can specify the line width, so how thick we want it to be, the color, and the alpha on it. And so for our width, we're just going to go ahead and do 2. And then for our color, we're going to go ahead and do black. So 0x, 000000. And then we're going to go ahead and apply some alpha, so it's not just plain black. We'll do 0.5. So if we jump back over to our scene, what we should see is now we should see our rectangle for our draw pile being shown here. So now for the rest of our draw pile, we want to go ahead and create our image game objects to sit on top of our pile here. And so for that, we're going to create 3 image game objects that represent our cards, and we're going to go ahead and place them here. So to keep track of those cards, we're going to add a new property to our class because later on, as we were playing our game, we saw that the number of cards in our discard pile could shrink once we're down to 2, 1, or 0 cards. And so we'll need to be able to reference those game objects so we can hide them later. And so by putting those in a property, we'll be able to do that very easily. And so let's add a new private property. We're going to call this draw pile cards. And we're going to go ahead and just set that to a phaser, game objects, an image array for our type. So then what we'll do is back down in our create draw pile method. Let's go ahead and add in, we'll initialize our array to an empty array. So we'll do our draw pile cards, will be empty array. And now we want to go ahead and create these. So let's do a simple for loop. We'll do let I equal 0. I is less than 3. We'll increment it. Now let's go ahead and create our image game objects. And so for this, we're going to go ahead and create a new method to actually create our cards, because we need to create a number of these game objects in our scene. And so let's go ahead and put that inside a method so we can easily do that. So what we'll do is we'll do this. We'll reference our draw pile cards. We'll do push so we can add in a new game object. And then what we'll do is we'll call this new method. So we'll do this, we'll do private, we'll do create card. So for this method, we're going to want our X and Y for where we want our card to be positioned. So let's go ahead and reference our draw pile X and then our draw pile Y. So now for our cards, we don't want them to be all in the same position horizontally. Instead, we want them to be stacked. And so for us to have that effect, we just need to bump up our X value as we create our next card in our iteration. And so to do that, we can just go ahead and add a little bit to our X, and we're just going to do I times 5. So that'll give us the effect where on our first iteration, it'll be plus 0, and this will be plus 5, and then plus 10, and that way it's just nudged over just a little bit. So now what we need to do is create this new method. So let's go ahead and do create card, and we'll want an X will be a number, Y will be a number, and now we want to go ahead and actually return something. And so we'll return our phaser, our game objects, and we want to return our image. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this line of code here. We create our image game object from our create method. Let's get rid of that from there. We'll go ahead and place it inside here. Then we're going to go ahead and return that image game object that we just created. All right, so now what we need to do is now we need to modify our properties. And so we'll use our passed in X and Y. We'll do our asset cards, and for the time being now, let's just go ahead and reference our card back frames. We see the back of our cards. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to scale up our game object, and to do that, we can use the set scale method. And so this method, kind of like our origin, we can pass an X and a Y as separate values, or if we pass one, it'll be applied to both. And this will allow us to scale up our game object either vertically or horizontally by whatever we provide. And so by passing in our scale variable that we created before, we're going to go ahead and make this 1.5 times bigger than what it was originally. And so now we see our cards are a little bit bigger. We see our 3 card image game objects. All right, so that wraps up our draw card pile for the time being. Like I said, first we're just going to focus on getting our UI, and so we'll have our game objects representing our game present, and then we'll add in our functionality for able to actually move and interact with them later on. So next up will be our discard pile. And so for our discard pile, this will be very similar to our logic that we did for our draw card pile, where we're going to want to have our rectangle for when our discard pile is empty. And then we're going to have 2 image card game objects on top of our pile for once we have cards in our discard pile. And basically how these are going to work is once we only have 1 card in our discard pile, our bottom card will not be visible. So like this example here, we have the 7. When we move it around, this is the top game object. But once I draw another card, now we're going to go ahead and update our frame on that top game object. And we can now see that second card below our discard pile here. And so to go ahead and actually add this logic, let's add a new method to our game scene to go ahead and create our discard pile. So what we'll do is right below here, let's do this. We'll do create discard pile. Let's go ahead and create that method. And so we'll come down here. Let's go ahead and do create discard pile. We'll return nothing, so we'll do void for our return type. And now what we want to do is we'll go ahead and create our card location box. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this line of code here. Let's go ahead and paste it. Now we want to change this to our discard pile X and then our discard pile Y position. So we save, we should see our rectangle shape show up in our game. And now we want to go ahead and create our discard pile cards. And so we're going to want to go ahead and store a reference to those because we'll need to modify them as our game is going on. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this here. Let's go ahead and paste it. Let's update our property name. We'll do discard pile cards. Go ahead and copy that. So let's come up to the top of our class. We'll add in that new property. And our type will also be an array of image game objects. So now what we need to do is we need to create our 2 image card game objects, but we don't want them to be visible until we actually have cards in our discard pile. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is let's just copy this inner part of our code here where we do create card. So let's copy that. Let's go ahead and do const. We're going to store a reference to this. We're just going to call it bottom card. It'll be equal to this create card. And now we want to go ahead and pass in our discard pile X position and our discard pile Y position. And let's go ahead and get rid of this here because we want these to be stacked on top of each other. So go ahead and save. We should see our new card show up here. And then what we'll do is let's go ahead and add that to our discard piles array. So we'll do push and we will do our bottom card. So now to make this card not visible, we can go ahead and use one of our built-in methods. So we'll do set visible, we'll set it equal to false. And so now that card won't actually be shown to the player. We want to go ahead and do the same thing for our top card. And so we'll just go ahead and update our variable, do top card. Let's add that to our array. And now what we'll do is we'll keep our same X and Y position. And we'll also have this not be visible to the player when the game first starts. All right, so next up, we're going to go ahead and tackle our foundation card piles for our game. And so for our foundation card piles, we'll go ahead and create our outline of where we want those piles to be placed in our game. And so we'll create our 4 rectangles here. But one of the things that'll be different is we're only going to have 1 image object in each of these piles. And so what we're going to do is as we add cards to our pile, we're going to go ahead and use that 1 game object. And we're going to go ahead and make it visible to the player. And then at the same time, we're going to go ahead and update its texture to go ahead and show whatever card we just added to the pile. So as an example, now that we have our ace here, when I bring our 2 on top of our ace, what's going to happen is we're going to go ahead and just keep that same image game object that was already there. we're going to destroy the card that we just added, and then we're going to go ahead and update the texture of that original game object. And so for each of these piles, we only need to have one image game object for each pile. And so to go ahead and add that logic, let's jump over to our game scene. And we're going to want to go ahead and keep track of these piles. So let's make a new property to do that. I'm going to copy this here. I'm going to paste it. And so let's go ahead and do our foundation pile cards. And this will be an array of our card image game objects. And now let's go ahead and make a new method to create these piles. So let's do this. We'll do our create foundation piles. Let's go ahead and create that method. Let's come down to the bottom of our class. We're going to do create foundation piles. We won't return anything. Now let's go ahead and initialize our array. We'll do this. We'll do our foundation pile cards will be equal to an empty array. And so now what we want to do is we originally defined our X positions for our foundation piles to be placed in an array. So we're just going to go ahead and loop through this array to grab our X values, and then we'll go ahead and create our rectangle boxes as well as our card game objects using these positions. So down in our method, let's go ahead and loop through that array. And so we'll do our foundation pile X positions. We'll go ahead and do for each. So for each X value in our array, let's go ahead and create our draw location box. I'm just going to copy this here, go ahead and paste it. And so what we'll do is we'll have X, and now we want to go ahead and reference our foundation pile Y variable. And so let's go ahead and update this, and that should create it in the correct location. And now we want to go ahead and create our cards. And so what we'll do is we'll do const, we'll store them in a variable do card, will be equal to this, we'll do create card. Now we're going to go ahead and pass in X, we're going to go ahead and pass in our foundation pile Y position. And we won't go ahead and make it not visible for the time being. We'll go ahead and leave it visible so we just make sure our logic's working. And so we'll do this. We'll do our foundation pile cards. Let's go ahead and push in our card to our array. So now when our scene refreshes, we should see our 4 card image game objects show up in our scene. And since we made sure they're in the right positions, let's go ahead and set visible. We'll go ahead and set equal to false. So now we should see just our rectangle boxes as shown in our scene. All right, so the last pile we need to create now is going to be our tableau piles. And so for our tableau card piles, these are going to be a little bit different than our other card piles because what we need to do is we're going to place multiple image game objects on top of each other like this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a container game object to place all of our game objects inside for each of our piles. And so what a container game object is, it's just a way for you to group similar game objects together, and then that way you can do things to the parent container and it'll be applied to all of the child game objects. A good example of this is this stack of cards here. By positioning our container at the position that we want to be in, so like right here, for these 3 cards that are visible here, we don't need to actually specify our X property on these. Instead, we can have them be positioned based on that container game object here. And so by doing this, we'll be able to only have to worry about modifying our Y value for our stack of cards, and we'll let our container's positioning handle all the X position for all the cards inside this container. And so there's much more you can do with containers, but primarily for our game right now, that's how we'll be using them. We'll be using them for positioning our game objects together, so we don't have to do them individually. So to get started with this logic, let's go ahead and jump over to our game scene. And similar like what we did before, let's go ahead and make a new method to go ahead and store our logic for this functionality. And so we'll do create tableau piles. We'll go ahead, we're going to return void from this. Let's go ahead and call our method from up in our create method. So we'll go ahead and jump up there. And so now what we're going to want to do is for our 7 piles, we're going to have a container for each one. And so we'll want to go ahead and store a reference to each of those containers so we can reference them. And so what we'll do is let's go ahead and copy this here. Let's go ahead and paste it. For our property name, we're going to go ahead and do tableau containers. And so now for our type, it's not going to be an image game object. It's going to be a container game object. So now what we'll do is down in our method, let's go ahead and initialize our array to an empty array. So we'll do our tableau containers will be equal to an empty array. And now what we want to do is for each of our card piles, we need to go ahead and create our container and then create our image game objects to place inside them. So to do this, let's go ahead and do a for loop. So we'll do for, we'll do let I equal 0. If I is less than 7, we'll go ahead and do our loop, and we'll go ahead and increment this by 1. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we want to go ahead and create the container game object for each of our piles. And so to do this, we'll make a new variable. We'll do tableau container will be equal to this. We'll use our factory to go ahead and create our game objects. And on here, we have a method for creating our container game object. So like our other game objects, we need to specify our X and Y value for where we want our game objects to be placed in our scene. And so for the time being, we're going to make a new variable X. So we'll just do X. Now let's go ahead and reference our tableau pile, our Y position. And so for our containers, because we just place game objects inside them, we have the option to pass those game objects when we create our instance. For now, we're just going to pass in an empty array because we don't have any game objects to add yet. So figuring out our X value, what we need to do is we have our initial starting X position, but as we iterate through our array, we want to go ahead and bump this up, very similar to like what we did up here when we created our draw card piles where we updated our X value. And so to do that, we'll make a new variable. We'll do const X will be equal to, and we'll do our tableau pile X position. And so we'll go ahead and add, we'll do I times, we'll do 85 pixels, just so we'll have that spacing between each of our piles like we saw here. So then let's go ahead and add in our container to our array. So we'll do this, we'll do our Tableau containers, we'll do push, and let's go ahead and add in our Tableau container. So now that we have our container game object, it's not going to be visible to the player, so now we actually need to add game objects inside it for them to show up in our game. And so what we'll do for the time being, let's go ahead and just create one card game object, and just so we can see them appear where we expect them to appear. And so we'll do const, we'll do our card game object will be equal to this. We want to do create card. And so for positioning our cards, we want to go ahead and set these at 0, 0. And so when we place a game object inside the container, it's going to be placed relative to that container's position. And so this will make more sense once we actually place our cards. So let's go ahead and add this game object to our container. And to do that, we need to reference our container game object, and we're going to use the add method. And this will allow us to place that object or an array of objects inside our container. And so we'll go ahead and pass in our card game object. All right, so once our scene refreshes, we're going to see now we have our 7 card piles and we have our cards positioned where we want them to be. And so what's happening is we're creating that container game object that's not visible, and we're positioning it right where we want this to be. When we add in this card game object, it's going to use that relative position. Since we passed in 0, 0, it's going to place that card in the exact same position. Versus if we did something like this, where we go ahead and change it to be like 20, we'll see now our container would be placed here, and relative to that, our card would come down 20 pixels, and so it's 20 pixels away from that original position. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're positioning your game objects is when they're in the container, that position of the container will affect where your game object will appear. All right, so now we have our initial card. What we need to do for our piles is we need to start adding more cards to each of our piles as we increment them. So for our second pile, we should have 2 cards, 3 in the third, 4 in the fourth, and so on. And so to do this, we'll go ahead and do a nested loop inside this loop here to create that functionality. So what we'll do is let's do 4. We're going to do let j equal to 0. When j is less than I plus 1, what we'll do is we'll do j plus equals 1. And we'll go ahead and create our card inside that loop. And now we need to go ahead and update our y position to use that new variable. So do j times 20. Let's go ahead and save. So now when our scene refreshes, we'll now see our 7 card piles, and we'll see we have more cards increment as we go along here. So what we did here is we just have this nested array, and basically what we do is we have more iterations through here. That's going to bump up our I value, which means we're going to run this iteration more and more as we get further along in our iteration from here. So as an example, we're on our first pile. Because I is 0, we're setting it to really 0 plus 1, so we're going to run this one time. When I is 1, we're going to do add 1, so it's going to be 2. So we're going to have 2 iterations, then 3, and so on, so we get our cards. And so by using that j value for our y and basing it on that, that's how we can move our cards down to get the stack effect here. All right, with that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we'll continue working on our Solitaire game, and we're going to focus on adding in support for our player input. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to complete source code for this video, and as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.